Welcome everyone, Costin here with a discussion about the races of Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires that I personally believe should get a rework from Creative Assembly. I'm not saying that they will get a rework. In fact, I have a whole list of races and the kind of priorities I would expect Creative Assembly to assign to race reworks. I recommend checking it out if you're interested in what I expect rather than what I would personally hope for in Warhammer 3. Now, one of the races that should be at the top of this list, or very close to the top, would be Slaanesh, because there's tons of issues with Slaanesh in Warhammer 3. But if there is a race in Warhammer 3 that is guaranteed to get a rework, and a DLC at that, it is Slaanesh. We've had a Khorne DLC, we've had the Nurgle DLC, we've had the Tzeentch DLC. In fact, they're still working on the Tzeentch part of the DLC of Shadows of Change, but we've had the free out of 4 mono gods already. And in fact, every single DLC, with the exception of the Ogre Race Pack, the pre-order bonus for Warhammer 3, every single DLC has featured chaos in some way, shape, or form. Be it with the Chaos Dwarves, Warriors of Chaos, or the various mono gods. So Slaanesh is guaranteed to happen. In fact, the general expectation at this point is that Slaanesh is going to be part of the next DLC. And that may or may not include High Elves as well, and potentially Dark Elves. So that's the reason I'm not including it on this list, but yes, make no mistake on that, Slaanesh does need a rework, and hopefully Creative Assembly does a good job with it. At number 5, we have the High Elves. Now, the High Elves are a good race. They're a strong race. They just don't work very well within the context of the Warhammer 3 meta, at least given the current campaign pacing. But even if they change the campaign pacing and make longer campaigns more viable, there are still a number of issues that High Elves do have that make their campaign, especially in the early game, pretty excruciating, and also do affect their enjoyment in terms of replayability, because a lot of High Elven campaigns are ultimately based on around the same idea: conquer Ulthuan or gain control of Ulthuan one way or another, and then deal with the principal Dark Elf factions. It also works in a similar vein to the Dark Elves. The difference is that Dark Elves work very, very well in the early game, and that makes their campaigns more enjoyable. But let's take a look at the issue with High Elves. First off, you do have a large number of units, but there's almost never any reason in a High Elven campaign to diversify your armies, partly because Spearmen and Archers are really good, cost-effective, and powerful armies, and also partly because of the way your economy works and your growth works, requiring you multiple structures to achieve the same result as other races. You have 2 economic buildings. You have the Plaza, which gives you income and control, and then your principal economic building gives you more income the more control you have. So you're always incentivized as High Elves to get these 2 buildings. But then on top of that, you also have Elven Gardens, you have Elven Embassies, a lot of settlements in Ulthuan have ports, and then you also want growth on top of that, because a lot of the things that are interesting about the High Elves are locked behind higher tiers. So that is an annoying factor. Besides, High Elven units, until you get to tier 4, are not especially that interesting. Oh, you get Silver and Guard, so you can just recruit those instead of regular Elven Spearmen. Until you realize you need a tier 3 settlement and a tier 3 barracks, and yeah, they could be better line holders, but do you really need them? In fact, there is a strong argument that many people have made over the years that there's no point in recruiting anything over here, and what you should do in every High Elven campaign is recruit Spearmen and Archers without armor. Not even the light armor version. That's a waste of money, and I think that is one aspect that needs to be changed. Just the structure, design, the tier recruitment design, the way their economy works. Because the problem with High Elves, the way their economy works, it's limited early on, but you manage it, right? Because you have very strong early game armies, but it's pretty boring. And then when you do unlock the full economic potential of the High Elves, your campaign is long over. So it's just like, you will print money, and you'll have nothing to do with it. That is not especially a good way of playing a campaign. On top of that, High Elves have very limited hero recruitment until you get to tier 4. Unless you're playing Alariel or, Emmerich, you can only get 1 Noble and 1 Mage until you get to tier 4. That is pretty awful, because you're looking at dozens of turns to get to that point. Yes, Emmerich does work differently. Yes, Alariel does work differently. and even Teclis a bit differently with mages, but you're always going to encounter this kind of situation when you are playing a High Elven campaign. Even if certain High Elven campaigns get an extra hero capacity for certain heroes, they're still not going to have the others. That is not great. And I think that Creative Assembly has done a great job over the last couple of DLCs and reworks at making heroes far more available, because heroes are fun to have, especially early on in a campaign. I'm sure there's automatic skill management we could talk about, but that is an issue. And then you do also have to talk about like the Lord and hero recruitment itself with the whole influence system, how that's completely broken, because it's either a tedious engagement of a system, or you abuse it and get lords and heroes with ridiculously powerful traits that trivialize your entire campaign. This is one of the reasons High Elves need a rework, not just because they have issues in terms of variety or they're too weak. No, they're ridiculously broken. How broken? Think of a race that has instant construction and free construction. Think of a race that can get also an insane level of growth faction-wide if you play your cards right. This is the problem that I think Creative Assembly should also address with the High Elves. And then their entire research tree is just not really that interesting. There's a lot of things locked behind different structures, so there's not really that much choice. Whenever you're playing a High Elven campaign, you're always going to do the same things over and over and over again in terms of research. You're going to get military advancements, you're going to get archery prowess, you're going to get spear wall, maybe some militia training. Then you're going to get military advancements to precise fletching, light Philmar armor, and then you're going to try and get cultural advancements and trade advancements. But that's it. There's no choice, there's no variety, there's no reason to do things any differently. Now, I understand there's always a good way of researching certain things, but when there's only one path available, then that research tree might as well be completely removed from the game. That is my perspective on that subject. So those kind of issues, again, High Elves work, maybe they work a bit too well, then they completely trivialize the game. Like, yeah, Administrator Archmages and Administrator Mages completely break campaigns. Maybe they should address that. It's not just like, oh, a race needs to become stronger or have better variety. It's also they need to fix some of the nonsense that is available with races. And it's not about power creep. Like, plenty of people complain about Thunder Barges. That's irrelevant. This is very relevant. So I think these kind of things are the kind of power creep or the kind of power abuse that Creative Assembly should fix to a certain extent. Maybe limit how powerful an administrator is. Maybe change the entire influence system and entire trait system and delete all our load-saved characters so we can't just abuse that. I don't know, just throwing some ideas out there, but certainly High Elves should get a rework. There are high chances that they will get a rework. There are fairly high chances they are going to be part of the Slaanesh DLC, but it's not guaranteed in the same way as it is with Slaanesh. That's why I'm putting them on this list. And number 4, we have the Beastmen. Now, the Beastmen, when they were reworked in Warhammer 2, they ended up being a fantastic race. For Warhammer 2. They haven't necessarily made the translation from Warhammer 2 into Warhammer 3 all that well. Now, Beastmen could certainly benefit from longer campaigns being far more viable, and that's certainly something Creative Assembly is working on if their campaign beta is anything to go by. But even so, there are still a number of issues that Beastmen do have to deal with in their campaigns that does degrade the campaign experience, especially if you're buying the Beastmen race pack. If you're buying Silence and the Fury, there's almost no reason to buy the Beastmen race pack, with the exception of like just being able to confederate the other legendary lords of the Beastmen. But that is not really the best reason to bother with a race pack, because these legendary lords are not really that great. Their skill lines, yeah, okay, they get the job done, but they're nothing particularly awesome as some other skill lines. And these legendary lords also lack unique campaign mechanics. One of the things that was really good with both Omens of Destruction and Fronts of Decay is how they made existing campaigns far more interesting to play. It's not like Elspeth came out and she suddenly is the best Empire campaign. I mean, she certainly has one of the best Empire campaigns, but Karl Franz and Gellert are also really good campaigns. Or you look at the Ogres. You have Maneater's campaign, you have Greasus' campaign, you have Scrag's campaign, and those campaigns are also all very interesting to play. Or you look at Skarsnik versus versus Gorbad, Ironclaw versus Warzag, and the changes that have been made over there. It doesn't necessarily need to be sweeping changes, but some kind of uniqueness in terms of campaign mechanics for the various Legendary Lords of the Beastmen would be in order. On top of that, I would say that one of the bigger problems of the Beastmen is that they're using Dread for every single thing, or almost every single thing in their campaign. With the exception of items that you can buy for money, you're using Dread for your unit camps, you're using Dread for confederating Legendary Lords and increasing hero capacity, you're using it for various Hearthstone and camp upgrades, army capacity. That's a lot to use a single resource they gain in the campaign, and it certainly makes the early game of the Beastmen not really that interesting. And at the very least, at the moment, the early game is where a lot of the campaign has relevance at the moment in Warhammer 3. Obviously, that is subject to change to be certain, but I do firmly believe that Creative Assembly should consider changing the mechanics of the Beastmen so you're not just using one resource for so many different things. Because you're going to be far better off, instead of increasing like Gore or Ungor capacity, you're going to be far better off, getting Legendary Lords or getting hero capacity or getting various upgrades over here, as opposed to a lot of the units that you have here. Like, until you get to Sangors, there's almost no reason to increase any unit capacity over here for any of the units you have available. So that means that your armies end up being less varied, because you do have that competition of various resources. Now, to be sure, this can be an issue for the Chaos Dwarves, but you gotta keep in mind, Chaos Dwarves have a lot of different things that they can do, and a lot of different resources. I'm not saying that Beastmen should have an economy in the same way as the Chaos Dwarves, but some kind of different ways to increase army capacity, or get various camp upgrades, or Hearthstone upgrades, getting federations of Legendary Lords, hero capacity, would be in order from my personal perspective on the subject of the Beastmen. And then the final aspect I would say is that Beastmen are limited as a race, in the sense that diplomacy overhaul is a pretty big feature of Warhammer 3, but the Beastmen don't really interact with it. Now, of course, Beastmen thematically, it makes sense that they wouldn't, but you're just basically removing a significant portion in terms of campaign mechanics that pretty much everyone else has to deal with, and you're not having to deal with it as the Beastmen. That makes for more simplistic campaigns and not necessarily better campaigns. That is my perspective on the Beastmen. It's pretty easy to talk about the issues that they do have. So overhaul of Legendary Lords, the Dread mechanic, and even the events that they get over here through the Dark Moon could become more interesting, because the events with the Dark Moon are not really that great either. So just a couple of things. Not necessarily the kind of reworks that, say, a race like Slaanesh would need, but certainly some reworks or updates would be in order for the Beastmen. At number 3, we have the Lizardmen, and there are a lot of issues that hopefully Creative Assembly would address with them. One of the bigger issues is that Lustria in itself is just not really well designed as a campaign area, or jungle warfare in general has a lot of problems that hopefully Creative Assembly will look to address. There's just terrain problems, glitches, all manner of issues in Lustria, which makes it far less than an ideal location for any campaign, for any race, really. Even if you have the Underway, it's still not a great area to have a campaign in. And Lizardmen are not really that great in dealing with the jungle. It says a lot that Ogres, Skaven, Greenskins are just that much better at dealing with the jungle than the native inhabitants. So that's one of the problems. The other issue has to do with all kinds of restrictions on recruitments. Oh, you want Sacred Karak Scars? Get the structure for that. Oh, you want Horned Ones? Get the structure for that. And it becomes such an annoying aspect having to get different structures for the unlocking of different units. To be fair, there's only a handful of units that do fit the bill with respect to that, but still a frustrating aspect. Then you have the problem with heroes. with certain heroes only increasing their capacity, not even at tier 4, but at tier 5. That is just an absurd design for the Lizardmen. And honestly, I don't think Lizardmen have ever been really that great as a race in the first place. So all kinds of issues with regards to that. Then there's the lackluster performance of many of their legendary lords. Like Lord Mazdamundi should be one of the most powerful beings in the Warhammer universe. He was designed to shape continents. You see this mountain range? He built it with his mind. When the Skaven blew up the moon, he saved the world. Well, he and Lord Croak. So it gives you an idea of the kind of power that he should have. But he's such a weakling of a caster. There's all kinds of issues with that. Structure issues, economy issues, limitations on armies, limitations because of the jungle warfare, the rights themselves. In fact, rights in general should be overhauled for every race that has them, like the cooldown, the cost, the effects of them. Just some of them are really good, but very long cooldown. Others are just practically worthless for the most part to spend money on. So some kind of overhaul with regards to rights would be really good. But one of the bigger problems of the Lizardmen actually has to do with their research tree. You can't research anything unless you have a structure for it. So you end up in this kind of situation where you're just building all kinds of different structures just to unlock research. And that just isn't a great dynamic to deal with. And then you also build slower than other races. Like a tier 3 provincial capital takes 6 turns. Yes, you can reduce the construction time, but even then you're not necessarily going to get an advantage compared to other races. You're just going to end up on a similar level. And to top it all off, there is the Geomantic Web, which is one of the most useless campaign systems in the entire game. The sole reason that the Lizardmen are not at the top of this list is that the races that are higher have some bigger issues. But make no mistake, out of the races that are on this list, I would say that the Lizardmen come the closest, or are the only race where you could just completely remove them from the game and build them back up from scratch, and it might just be better than trying to make changes, because you need to make changes to economy, to heroes, hero capacity, unit recruitment, research, rights, campaign systems like the Geomantic Web Jungle, like just complete, burn to the ground, build it up, back up again, which is not something I can say for any other race that is on this list. I'm not sure Creative Assembly actually cares about it. I'm not sure Games Workshop cares that much about the Lizardmen these days, honestly, considering how they've handled them in Age of Sigmar. It's all about them elves. Well, elves, greenskins, Sigmar, all that. And number 2, we have Norsca, a race with a limited unit roster, a poor economy, poor campaign design, horrible victory conditions, a research tree that feels very useless in a lot of different ways. You have a faction that's focused on naval supremacy, but is not particularly great for the job. Like, Norsca is a joke for everyone to deal with. Like, they're the one faction right now, the one race right now. If you're dealing with them, you're literally just farming them for XP. They do have some good units, and they do have some interesting ideas, like their monster hunts having some really difficult quest battles. Maybe a bit too difficult compared to what they should be, because they could technically be considered the hardest quest battles in the game. But at the same time, they're just broken, literally. They're bugged. They're using the old quest system, which Creative Assembly removed for pretty much everything else except them. It just goes to show the lack of attention to Norsca in a lot of different ways. The fact that you only have 2 legendary lords, and they're not really that different from one another. They don't necessarily have unique campaign mechanics or anything like that. Like, poor Wulfric. When you think of the fact that Maneater, Scarbrand, Skulltaker, Arbol, and others are much better at the one campaign mechanic that Wulfric should have, which is teleportation around the world dealing with champions, like, yeah, he should kind of be like what Skulltaker is right now, in some way, right? Or what Axiatl should be about. But he's not. He's a joke. So is Trog. Poor Trog. He's not lore accurate at all. He could use a significant overhaul. Just the entirety of Norsca could use a significant overhaul. Their unit roster is also not really that great. I mean, there's some good units like Berserkers and Marauder Champions and some monsters, but then you run into the common issue that's been for every race on this list, like, oh, you want to get heroes? Get screwed. Now, for Norsca, this is not necessarily the problem with like 2 out of 3 heroes, but here's the real kicker over here. Casualty replenishment. Norsca can get casualty replenishment, but they require tier 4 in order to even recruit that casualty replenishment hero, and increases their capacity. That is not a great dynamic. They do have all of these favors of the different gods like Nurgle, Slaanesh, Khorne, and Siege, but also this requires you to raise settlements to the ground. However, Norsca's economy is not good enough to sustain their army, so you end up in this gameplay loop where you're sacking a settlement one turn, raising the settlement next turn, and then hopefully trying to take it over that turn as well, because you do need the ports in particular. You do have a confederation mechanic that works much better for greenskins and ogres. Norsca is not a Warhammer free race. They're not even a Warhammer 2 race. They're a Warhammer 1 race in Warhammer free. And they've never really gotten the attention they deserve. Like, when they were introduced in Warhammer 1, yeah, that was great. In Warhammer free, however, not really all that much. Like, just a very bad DLC in general, and could really use some love and attention. Hopefully Creative Assembly will give them that. I think they should. I don't think it's necessarily a priority, though, for them. But who knows? Maybe we'll get the Norsca DLC at one point, and a significant Norsca overhaul as well. And finally, and number 1, is the Undead. Not just the Vampire Coast, which I'm showing right here, but all of the Undead factions. To be fair, the Vampire counts work the best out of all the Undead races in the game at the moment, but they all have their kinds of issues, be it the lack of uniqueness and legendary lords in the Vampire counts, and the lack of units, the horrible unit roster and campaign mechanics of the Vampire counts, and also the horrible campaign mechanics and limited army capacity of the Tomb Kings. Regardless of how you view it, all of the Vampire or Undead factions do need significant overhauls to make them work better within the context of Warhammer 3. The Books of Nagash, the limited aspects of the Vampire counts, just the balancing decisions of the Vampire Coast. Like, I understand the intent of this race, I just don't believe it works at all within the context of Warhammer 3. Warhammer 3 is not Warhammer 2. You can't judge it by what worked in Warhammer 2. Because in Warhammer 2, having a couple of really powerful armies, but limited in quantities, like in terms of hero capacity, quality of units, that worked because of supply line limitations. That's a pretty big factor. But you don't have those limitations in Warhammer 3. And given how many armies AI can pump out, it certainly becomes a real issue when you might have a really powerful army with really powerful casters that could solo entire forces on their own, but when you're outnumbered 3-1, 4-1, that suddenly becomes an issue. You have a limited economy, you're relying on sacking and looting settlements, but then you also have this cove mechanic which helps you increase your hero capacity, and which you need, and also leaves enemy factions alive for the Vampire Coast. The research trees for all the for all Undead factions are just a significant mess of a situation. Their victory conditions for the Tomb Kings are ridiculous. The fact that if you're playing a Tep, you have to fight Cetra is completely absurd. The Books of Nagash don't work. I can go on, and I have gone on these details, but suffice to say, I do firmly believe all of the Undead factions do need significant reworks. If I were to prioritize one over the other, I would say like Vampire Coast would be at the top, followed by the Tomb Kings, and then finally the Vampire counts. In fact, what I find surprising about the Vampire counts is, out of all the races and all the factions in Warhammer 3, they actually work really well, considering the fact that they have not gotten the kind of significant overhauls that many other races have gotten. And some races have actually fallen behind them, like just consider the Beastmen. But yeah, they could use more units, more unique campaign mechanics. They could use an update. Tomb Kings and Coast could use significant overhauls. But yes, all Undead factions do need some love and attention. And hopefully we will get that with Nagash, if Creative Assembly ever decides to add Nagash. I think they will. I think it would be pretty weird to not add Nagash and Tankwell, for instance, in Warhammer 3, and end the game without them. But I guess we have to wait and see on that subject. The only thing that's certain is that we're going to get the Monkey King and Slaanesh. Everything else is, you could say, speculation to a degree or another. Though there is some evidence, you know, for Dogs of War and all that kind of stuff. That's all I had to say. Questine signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications. Stay tuned for more.